We have to change the system to reflect our better selves. I think we've got to end the practice of drawing our congressional districts so that politicians can pick their voters and not the other way around.
No, it's very unfair. You have an election in a little more than 60 days and they change the district on you, and you've already won primaries. How does that work? The court system, okay? How does that work? You've all gone through primaries, or most of you have. It's been districted for many years, and now you have to redraw lines to have a new district, even though you won a primary in another district?
There are only two ways to do districting, right? Way one is that you have some sort of quasi-impartial board that actually draws the districts. The problem is these boards are rarely impartial, and historically those boards have been biased to one side or another, and so gerrymandering has been the way that we've done politics in the United States for 300 years at this point.
And I commend the people that did the work for Voters Not Politicians. It was an all-volunteer army of people that have had it with politics as usual, who want government that represents us, that works for us, the people again. I think that the gerrymandering that the Michigan legislature has done to pick their constituents, instead of constituents picking our legislators, has contributed to this environment.
It is not a Republican issue, and it is not a Democratic issue. Both parties do the same thing. In some states it's the Republicans that do it, the gerrymandering, and in some states it's the Democrats that do it. And the bottom line is normally when an actor comes out of the court, it's because he got probation. But this is a little different, because we are here today to ask the Supreme Court to fix something that the politicians will never do.
It doesn't take an expert to see that American politics has been getting a little messy recently. Political corruption usually catches the eyes of most Americans in the news, with the exception of partisan gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when voting district boundaries are purposely redrawn to give an advantage to a political party. In the United States, this can happen on both the state and federal levels, although the most commonly discussed field is that of the congressional level. In the United States, congressmen are elected to represent districts within states. The number of representatives a state has is proportional to the population size of said state, which is updated every 10 years following a census. However, it is entirely up to the states on how they decide to vote for their congressmen. This means that states have the power to draw congressional district borders, but they can also opt to use an entirely different system of voting, like a parliamentary system, so long as it elects the same amount of representatives. Let's take a step back for a second and describe the different types of gerrymandering. The first type is called cracking. This method involves spreading out a population of voters across multiple districts to ensure that they are the minority in each district. This makes it almost impossible for them to win a majority in these districts, and loses them more seats as a result. The second type is called packing. This method compresses a voting population into a single district. Since this group of people is placed into a district mainly compiled of other people with similar ideals, they will most likely always win a seat in Congress. However, it gives the other political party an overall advantage because that party that was packed now has less political power and influence in other districts. Obviously, gerrymandering plays a key role in sparking conflict among political parties. But most politicians decide to stay away from this topic as it can be used to their own party's advantage. But exactly how are districts redrawn? Well, let's start with the basics. Each state must have a certain number of districts that's equal to the number of congressmen they will receive in the House of Representatives. The size of these districts is currently around 711,000 people a district as of 2018. They can be, and usually are, redrawn every 10 years following a census. Not all states go through the same process, and many of them differ, although only slightly. Every state passes its new district boundaries through their respective state legislators. However, some states have independent commissions that draw up congressional districts for the state legislators to then approve. Although these commissions do a relatively okay job of keeping political bias out of redistricting, it is still up to the state legislators to then approve the new map. This results in a system that still has some political bias. An example of this type of system is New Jersey. A change of congressional districts starts with an independent commission of 13 members, the members of which are chosen by the legislative leaders for both the Democrat and Republican parties in each of the two legislative chambers, and the state chairman of each party. They all pick 2 commissioners. Their picks cannot consist of current congressional members. The 12 people picked as commissioners must then pick a 13th member who has not held public office within the last 5 years. If they are unable to agree on a 13th member, they will present 2 names to the New Jersey Supreme Court to then decide for them. When the time comes to redraw the congressional districts, the Commission will create and agree on a map that is then presented to the legislator for approval. If the Commission cannot agree on a map before the deadline, the Commission must present 2 maps to the New Jersey Supreme Court to then decide which one wins. Redrawing of the state legislative districts are a completely separate process on their own, but follow a similar structure. In contrast, North Carolina presents and approves congressional and state legislative districts through its state legislature entirely. This results in North Carolina having some of the most gerrymandered districts in the whole country. The practice of gerrymandering presents several legal and constitutional issues. Although the practice is undoubtedly corrupt, gerrymandering has several legal protections. As said earlier, the 10th Amendment in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution implies that states have the right to draw congressional district boundaries themselves. However, the argument has been made that gerrymandering violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which states that citizens cannot legally be discriminated against, and that the government cannot deprive anyone of their rights. This argument claims that gerrymandering limits one's ability to represent themselves in government and therefore vote. Another argument brought against gerrymandering in the Supreme Court case of Jill v. Whitford is that gerrymandering actually violates your First Amendment right to freedom of speech and association. However, this argument was shut down by the courts because people could still vote for the desired political parties, regardless of whether or not your vote had been diluted. Regardless of the legality behind it, the practice of gerrymandering has some unintentional and unavoidable consequences. One obvious result is that it discourages people from voting and getting involved in politics, as gerrymandering districts makes these individuals' votes worth little. It also makes Congress less representative of the people. This is not only because gerrymandered districts disproportionately represent certain political views over others, which it certainly does, but also because it creates districts that have unnaturally extreme political views. This results from voters being isolated to their own districts with little competition, and so moderates are actually favored less than more extreme candidates because the political views of their constituents are centered further either towards the left or to the right relative to typical American communities. With an ever-increasing political divide between parties, gerrymandering supports the ideals of authoritarianism by allowing political parties to corruptly undermine each other and forcibly remove the competition of their competitors rather than appealing to the actual views and concerns of the public. This is a system far from what our founding fathers would have wanted, and it is definitely not the type of system most Americans wish to be under. Although people generally agree gerrymandering is a corrupt practice that shouldn't be allowed, people can't agree on how to do that. As said earlier, state governments have resulted to creating independent commissions to limit gerrymandering, but only do so much with limited success. Those who agree districts should exist at all can't even agree on how those districts should be drawn. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to what the individual thinks of as fair. Is fair lumping communities of similar ideologies into their own districts to make congressmen more representative of who they are? Or is it making districts relatively even in terms of voter population so that congressmen are more moderate and balanced and care more about the local needs of the population?